By that is I was reading my Bible, and I was specifically reading, I wrote it down here just to help me here, a little bit of notes. I was reading James. So James 1, chapter 1, verses 1 through 27. And one thing that I didn't know for years, probably until like 2006, and I was already, in my 30s, was the fact that James, one of the disciples of Christ, is actually his half brother. They grew up together. They were in the same household. They were, children together. They played together. They knew each other at a different level than anyone else would have known him. I mean, James knew him as family. And so that got me to thinking about how that would have been like. Can you imagine getting in an argument with child Jesus or getting a spat? Or maybe that wasn't the case. Maybe they were very close. Maybe they had a great relationship that didn't have arguments. But I mean, typically siblings at one point or another have disagreements. So I kind of started thinking about that and imagining what that would be like. And when I read my Bible, I obviously do read it to learn and grow as a Christian. I still kind of consider myself a baby Christian. But at the same time, I really am into the historical aspect of it and just kind of imagining things, how they were back then in that type of environment and so on and so forth. So anyhow, this section that I was reading, I learned also about James that he was referred to as James the Just, or James the bondservant. And a bondservant is someone who serves the Lord. So interesting fact is that James was not a follower of Christ when he was doing his ministry. When Jesus decided that it's time for me to speak of thy Father and let them know who I am, and started performing miracles and started having a ministry and going from city to city, town to town. He wasn't involved in that. He was just not a believer. And I guess, from a worldly standpoint, or maybe a worldly realistic standpoint, I could understand how James was probably like, is my brother going crazy? He's, stating all of these things. What's going on here? So, I mean, I'm not trying to sound blasphemous at all. I'm just thinking about how that would have felt like for him. But what ended up happening was somewhere between the time that Jesus resurrected and did his ascension, within a time frame of like 40 days, Jesus appeared to James and told him, look, you knew that I was crucified, and here I am in front of you. And I'm, speculating that something along those lines was stated, because it doesn't say that specifically in scripture. It just states that he presented himself to him. And so from that point, James became a believer, but also a servant, because he realized that Jesus Christ indeed is the Son of God. So and his I guess, how would I say this? His contribution was extremely significant. So anyhow, in saying that, there's a couple of notes that I had taken. So again, I'm just kind of referring to a study guide that I have here. James was talking about some attributes, and I think those attributes are very applicable to today's life. And what I'm looking here is, it says here, so far James had addressed the importance of enduring trials and temptations, the results of God's goodness in a transformed life of the believer. In the remaining verses of chapter 1, he attempts to keep the reader's attention with a strong word of caution, a striking comparison, and the evidence of obeying God's command. So here it talks about, on verse 19 specifically, for the people to be swift to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath. Now, isn't that applicable to all of us nowadays? It really, really is. And I actually, throughout my adulthood, have struggled with this. Be swift to hear means, listen attentively and quickly. Listen to what other people have to say. Even if you disagree with them, still listen, hear them out. Secondly, be slow to speak. And to me, this means to really think before you speak, because once the words are said, you can never take them back, ever, ever. And I mean, I'm sure that many of you can think of about a fight that you've had or an argument that you've had with maybe a loved one where you're so in the heat of the moment or so frustrated that you just say something. You either say something because that's what you're thinking, or you say something just to kind of get back at them or to prove a point. But sometimes when you say things, it never goes away. And I'm going to go ahead and give you an example. So my husband, when we first got married, within a year, we moved 3 times. And the reason that we moved 3 times was because when we decided to get married, the lease that I was living in, which was the bigger home, was coming to an end. So we didn't live together. But when we moved into this, the second place, we were a married couple, and I signed a year lease at this other place. And after the year, because it all of a sudden became prime property, they wanted to increase the rent by $350. That was just ridiculous. So we had to move again. And so the third time that we moved, I was excited. I grew up moving around a lot. I literally went to 13 different schools when I was a student. And I managed to stay in the same middle school and high school, but elementary, I don't have friends from elementary because we moved so much. So to me, I'm used to moving. It's not a big deal. But to him, it's a huge deal. So anyway, my husband called me a nomad. Can you believe that? He called me a nomad. And I didn't even know what it was. But he's like, you're such a, nomad. And I thought, what the heck is that? So I get my phone out and I Google it because I didn't want to, say something back, defend myself, not prepared, I guess was my reaction. And so I looked it up and I'm like, oh, and it turns out that it means these people that kind of live like gypsies, they just travel from one place to another and they never settle. And till this day, here I am talking to you about it many, many years later, and I still remember how much it hurt that he said that about me. Now, I know that he said it out of frustration. I know that he didn't mean to hurt me, but you know what? It stuck. And when I think about it, now I can laugh about it. But for a long time, I was just like, gosh, I can't believe that you think this way about me. So anyhow, it's important for us to really hold our tongue and not say anything and really think it through before we react. And the other thing that James talks about is slow to wrath. I know that, again, I'm guilty of this. I get defensive right away. And I think that part of the reason is because I grew up in an environment where I a lot of times I felt like I had to fend for myself and I really had to fight, and I had the mentality of you're not going to make a victim out of me, or you're being unfair, or are you discriminating against me? And I don't know exactly where I got that from. I mean, I would think that probably from life experiences, but I was very, very quick to get angry right away. And so James is actually talking about how if we, are not swift to hear, if we are not slow to speak and slow to wrath, it doesn't bring righteousness. And, it doesn't bring the best of us. And God wants us to be our very best version of ourselves and to walk in his, in Jesus Christ's path. And so if that's the case, we need to to learn to control those character flaws is what I'm getting at. So anyhow, that's pretty much, you know, the study that I was able to get in today, and I'm still kind of like, what? James was Jesus' half brother? Oh my goodness gracious, how, you know, how crazy is that? So, I mean, I had read before, like I said, 2006 is when I found out. But before that, I mean, I knew he had family, but I just didn't realize that one of them was someone who contributed a lot to his ministry. So, very cool. Let's see, what did I learn on the radio today? So I was listening to Pastor Chuck from Calvary Chapel, and he was talking about Revelation. And what's interesting about that is that he was talking about how there's going to be a time, and I got into my car at 6:07 and it starts at 6, so I missed a good portion of it, and I'm like, where do I find this? But I know it's in Revelation. And he was talking about how there's going to be a time where somewhere in the Middle East where there's a lot of oil, you can kind of imagine where I'm talking about. In the back of my mind, I'm thinking Saudi Arabia, maybe, Iran, you know, I'm not sure. But I believe that it's going to be within kind of geographically in that area. But anyhow, Pastor Chuck was talking about how there's going to be like a meteorite. It says the stars are falling and it's going to cast fire, and the fire is going to be burning beneath the ground, and everything's going to turn into ash within that area. And so he explained how every so many thousands of years, you know, there's this phenomena that occurs where there's like meteorite showers, and depending on the situation, it could actually hit maybe a source of land that has a lot of oil not too far beneath it and can cause something catastrophic. So that's why I like listening to Pastor Chuck, because he puts things in perspective of like using science of things that do happen to explain some of the things that are described in the Bible. So I thought that was like, what? Wow. And you know, that's my drive in the morning to work. So I was just kind of thinking about that. So what I want to do tonight is kind of look at Revelation and see where I can find this and learn a little bit more so that I can share. So that's all I've got for today. I just wanted to say thank you for those of you that are kind of following this. I mean, I don't know if I'm doing right or if I'm doing wrong. It's just my heart tells me that I should, and we can grow together in our faith. We can use what we learn to be better people. So, I mean, what I've learned today is even with my coworkers, with my bosses, with my family, you know, I definitely need to be open to hearing and kind of watch my tongue. Don't speak too quickly, think it over, and not get angry. So anyhow, I hope you enjoyed my clip, and we'll see you tomorrow.